we're going to do a little bit of news before our program, but our program today, we're going to welcome Robert E. Harpold, a member of the Trajectory Design Team, responsible for creating the path Artemis I spacecraft took from the Earth to the Moon and back again. So before that, just a little bit of news, a few minutes. First of all, especially for the new people who are here, Parsec meetings are always free to attend and open to the public. But you can support us by becoming a member. Dues are only $30 a year. You add $10 for each associate voting membership in the same household. Okay. Little standing committee news. Again, we were talking about Confluence there. That's going to take place this July 21st, 22nd, and 23rd at the Sheraton Pittsburgh Airport Hotel. That's on Thorn Run Road in Coraopolis. And you can learn more from the Confluence website, which is confluence-sff.org. And again, that'll be in the chat here after a bit. And this year's guest of honor is Ada Palmer. Ada's Terra Ignota series from Tor Books explores a future of borderless nations and globally commixing populations. And our featured music guest is Sassafras. And Sassafras is a singing group performing original cappella folk music, mostly with fantasy, mythology, and science fiction themes. All right, so we're going to welcome to Robert. Robert E. Harpold is an engineer working for ERC Inc., a subcontractor for NASA, designing trajectories for the Artemis missions. His article, Flybys, Launch Windows, and Selfies with the Earth and the Moon, appeared in the March 2023 issue of Dreamforge Anvil, link to be in the chat. And for your information, Robert has written a couple great science fiction stories for Dreamforge. The first one, Extremophile, was in Dreamforge issue 4 and is available to read free online. The second, No Hugs for Holographic Fathers, will be published online this fall and in our print edition at the end of the year. Now, as to Artemis, last year on November 16th, 2022, the uncrewed Artemis I mission was launched to the moon. As the first major space flight of NASA's Artemis program, Artemis I marked the return of the agency to human lunar exploration, originally begun with the Apollo program. Artemis I was the first integrated flight test of the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System, SLS. Robert Harpold's presentation takes us behind the scenes of the Artemis I flight and gives us an idea of the amount of work that went into the entire Artemis I mission by focusing on the work of one team, the Trajectory Design Team, responsible for creating the path the spacecraft took from the Earth to the Moon and back again. We get to go behind the scenes today where, after so many years, we've sent a human-rated spacecraft back to the moon. Robert Harpold has operated a weather satellite and a space weather spacecraft for NOAA, and for a different NASA project has flown over Greenland and Antarctica to collect data on their elevation changes. He is married to his amazing and accomplished wife, Julie, and has a young and very smart daughter named Isabel, who we've already heard yelling in the background. So we welcome both, Robert and Isabel. Robert, why don't you say hello and start your presentation?
Greetings, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I think it worked earlier, so I'm assuming it will work again.
There you go.
Okay. So it's going to start off talking about the nominal trajectory. That's a trajectory that we wanted to fly and that we actually ended up flying, so that was good. Then I'm going to talk about the off-nominal trajectories. I think before the meeting, Tokes was talking a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about the mission evaluation room. That's where we were during the flight when we were on console. And then I'll talk about Targo. That's the name of our console for our team. And then talk about a few things that happened during the flight. So this is, I'll go into more detail about this later, but this is the nominal trajectory. So just in general, we started off from the Earth, we came out to the moon, we did a flyby, and that sent us in the direction we wanted, and then we entered our target orbit, which I'll talk about more later. Then we left the target orbit, came back to the moon, did another flyby, and it sent us back to Earth. And I'll talk about what all these initialisms mean later. And also I'll say, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just jump right in.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself if you have a question.
Oh, sorry. I was like, did I not mute myself? Or did I?
No,
was I on mute?
everybody else
else
is
is.
muted, but I wanted to make sure
Okay.
they could unmute if they want to ask a question, or they could get it into chat, and we'll make sure that it gets to you.
Okay. Thank you. And so some background on our target orbit. It's a distant retrograde orbit, which I thought was a really cool kind of orbit. It's not actually orbiting the moon, it's orbiting the Earth, but because of how the motion works out, it looks like if you were on the moon, it would look like the spacecraft was orbiting the moon backward. So in this diagram, it helps a little bit to visualize it, I think. The Earth is at the center. At this initial position, you have the spacecraft here between the Earth, and then this is the moon over here. And so as the moon continues in its trajectory, it kind of cuts in front of the spacecraft. And so it looks like from an observer on the moon, like the spacecraft is going behind the moon. And then they come up to this point, and now their positions have switched so that the spacecraft is behind the moon, or the moon is between the Earth and the spacecraft now. And then they continue, and this time it's the moon that's swinging farther out. And so it looks like it's cutting in front of the spacecraft now. And so it looks like at this point that the spacecraft has gone in a full orbit around the moon backward. And then it repeats that motion. So within one orbit of the moon around the Earth, it looks like the spacecraft has gone around the moon backward twice. And so, well, I guess maybe here's a good point to talk about it. The reason for going to this particular orbit, it was a leftover from the asteroid redirect mission. And probably some of you have heard about that, but the idea was, at one point, the Orion program's goal was to visit an asteroid. And NASA, the original goal was to send a spacecraft out to the asteroid belt. And the NASA suggested maybe bringing an asteroid into a lunar orbit and then sending the spacecraft there because it'd be a little easier in some respects. And so they wanted to have a stable orbit for that asteroid so that they could park it there and would stay there for a long period of time. And these distant retrograde orbits are very stable, I think on the order of decades at least. And so that was the reason for that. And then eventually NASA's mission shifted from doing the asteroid redirect mission to go into the moon. So the asteroid part of the mission was gone, but the target orbit remained the same because there had already been a whole lot of analysis done on that and getting there. So that was the reason we targeted that particular orbit. So here's the nominal trajectory. Again, I guess, and here's where all the labels are explained. Most of these are burns during the flight. And so after Earth, it was about an hour and a half into the mission, we did TLI. That was the translunar injection. And I thought this was really cool because this was the same name of a burn that was done during the Apollo flights. And you probably heard some audio sometime of particularly Apollo 8, where the Capcom at the time, Michael Collins, said you would go for TLI. And I don't know, that was always kind of chill-inducing for me because that was the moment that humans sent ourselves beyond Earth orbit. And so I thought it was really cool that we had a burn with the same name. It was doing the same thing too. I mean, it makes sense that it had the same name, but it was still really cool that there was that tie with the Apollo program. And then we have OTCs, those are the outbound trajectory corrections. So those are on the outbound leg of the flight, and they're generally going to be small because you're going to have minor deviations from the trajectory that you thought you were going to hit. And so these correction burns put you back on that path. And so they're generally going to be pretty small. So we had several of those on the outbound leg. Then we came here to the moon where we did the outbound powered flyby, OPF. And that was a burn that happens pretty near Paralune, which is the closest point to the moon. And so we used the gravity of the moon to help boost that burn and kind of magnify the effect of the burn to send us on a path toward the orbit where we wanted to be in. So that sent us out in this direction. And here's where we performed DRI. That was the DRO insertion burn. And from this point, we were in our target orbit, the DRO. So we continued along until we got to DPC. That's the DRO plane change. So we did not have a DPC on this flight. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but one of the issues, if we had an eclipse during flight, and I'll talk more about what exactly that means, but to prevent that, we would do a plane change, or we would do a maneuver to change the plane of our orbit, and that would take us out of the eclipse. In this particular launch date, our trajectory didn't have an eclipse problem, so we didn't need to do a DPC burn. So the spot where we would have done a DPC just became a spot for a regular orbit maintenance maneuver. So we continued to the DRO. We got to this point, the DRD, the distant retrograde orbit departure burn. And at that point, it took us out of the DRO and sent us back to the moon, where we did RPF, the return powered flyby. And it's the same kind of concept as the OPF. We use the moon's gravity to magnify the effect of the burn. And that helped us redirect the spacecraft and send us back to Earth. And one of the things to note was before the RPF, all of these burns, if something had gone a little bit wrong, we had options to return the spacecraft. If RPF had not gone the way we planned, we could not have gotten the spacecraft back to Earth. We wouldn't have enough fuel to get back to the moon and try again. So this was our critical burn. And then on the way back, we came to EI. This is not a burn. It stands for entry interface. And that's the point where the spacecraft basically hits the atmosphere. And that's where our job ended. There was an entry design landing team and people who designed the entry trajectory. So we did interface with them a lot. I mean, we needed to know where to hit and what direction to be pointing in to make sure that we landed where we wanted to. And so they provided that information and we targeted it. So that's basically a summary.
Robert?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, what strikes me is, well, first of all of this is, you've determined all of this before anything has been launched, because you know where Earth and Moon are, you know all the mass calculations, fuel calculations, and all that. My question is basically, how dynamic is it during the actual mission? And what I kind of mean by that is, does it really mostly go off the way you expected, or is there something like maybe a burn is a quarter of a second longer than you thought, or there's some little bit of mass that you didn't expect or whatever, and you're really monitoring and saying, oh, we're slightly off and we have to make a correction. So I guess, how much is this, hey, it just works because we've done all this ahead of time, and how much is, oh, we're monitoring and it doesn't look like we're exactly where we need to be, we need to make a correction?
Right, yeah, so that's going to happen on every flight, that the burn isn't going to be maybe exactly where you thought it was, or there'd be some minor deviation in attitude that you didn't model that's going to send you a little bit off from where you thought you were going to be. So during the Apollo flights, they had trajectory correction burns all the time, and so do Earth orbiting missions. This flight in particular, this was the first time we'd flown the spacecraft, and so a lot of it was designed to test out the propulsion system and our attitude control. So these burns helped us kind of figure out, model better for future flights, how the spacecraft was actually going to perform. And so that's why we had so many, well, I think we're always going to have a lot of trajectory correction burns scheduled, but there was a little more uncertainty in this first flight than there will be in future flights. I think that answers your question, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Thank you.
I have a question. How do you determine the position of the rocket at any point in the travel? Do you use LiDAR coming off the moon? Are you using the Earth as a fixed point? And how do you accomplish that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you're in Earth orbit, you can use GPS to do that. Most spacecraft do. But once you get beyond Earth orbit, that's not an option anymore. So what we generally did was use ranging from the Deep Space Network on Earth. And there are antennas there. That's how you communicate with most of these spacecraft that are beyond Earth orbit. And so you can do ranging with those, and that's how you get an idea, or that's how you find out what your position is.
How much of a window do you have? Sorry. There you go.
Sorry, I caught part of that.
Yeah. How much of a window do you have when you're, when you're traveling from Earth to the moon? Are there a lot of windows, say versus Mars, where you have optimal orbits and distances, optimal times travel? The Earth our Earth to moon may be more liberal.
That's a good question. I don't know how they compare as far as the launch windows go. For us, it depended on the day. I mean, and I'll get more into that later, but you could have several hours, or you could have just a minute for the duration of your launch window. And to meet our mission objectives, we generally had 12 to 15 days per month where we could launch, and we would have 1 minute to several hours where we could launch. I do not know what that looks like for Mars flights.
You might just explain just for a minute what it actually means to have a launch window, because in my imagination, that's kind of when things are lining up, when your calculations for fuel and orbits and stuff are gonna work. But maybe in your words, explain what that idea is. Well, I've got a 1 minute window. It's like, well, what's outside that window? If I launch a minute before my correct minute, what happens?
Right. Yeah. So this is not my area of expertise. But my understanding, you have some fuel considerations. If you launch, you have a certain angle during which you can launch, and if you launch outside of that, it's going to be too expensive to get into a target orbit that you want. There are also considerations for your spacecraft overflying an area you don't want it to, like land or some populated area. And so we had some bounds for where the spacecraft could launch, and that's what constrained us.
Okay.
I hope that's enough, because that's as much as I know.
That's good.
I have a question on how this relates to the previous couple of slides. You showed the Earth orbit and the lunar orbit as an interacting set of things, and now
Over here?
yes, now okay, how does this picture relate to the other picture? Where are we in these various points?
No, that's a great question, and that leads into, I mean, it wasn't something I'd planned to talk about, but it is a very difficult part of the job, because you have different reference frames and you have to keep track of all of them and know which one you're working with at any given time. So this reference frame is centered at the Earth, and the spacecraft and the moon are their positions are given with respect to the Earth. This other one the nominal trajectory, I'll go over to the burns. This one is in a different reference frame. So all of these positions are done in a frame that's rotating. You have the Earth and the moon here, and there's a line between them. And we assume that this line is fixed. And the frame is rotating. If you had a fixed point, like if you were doing it from the center of the Earth, say, the moon would be moving around the Earth, but we're fixing this line in our reference frame, and we're changing all of the coordinates of all of these points so that they are in that rotating reference frame. And so that's why this looks a little bit different than the slide over here.
I think I've seen videos online that show how people, you think of, there's the sun, we're all rotating around the sun, but then there have been videos that show, but the sun is moving and this is what it really looks like. And I think that's kind of what you're saying is, like, if we made this into a video, we would see the two pieces come together a little bit more, because we wouldn't have just a fixed image here. We would be seeing that OTC 1 and 2 and 3 on the video moving along with the Earth and the Moon. It would be a different experience.
Right. If you go with this reference frame and you showed the motion, that's you would see them moving in this coordinate frame.
Yeah.
That's what I couldn't relate with, was exactly that.
It adds probably 100
I
levels of complexity to what we're trying to understand now.
Let's let Robert get a couple more slides in before we derail him again. So
I do
go
want
ahead,
to
get
point
back
out
on track.
that Kitty Mama has had her hand up. I don't know if the question has been answered, but
okay.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I am not a physicist, engineer, or no, I don't know anything about this, but I have a couple of maybe stupid questions. One,
Oh, no stupid questions.
One, why is an eclipse a problem?
No, that's
and-
actually a very good question. I was going to
Oh.
get to that more later. I don't know if you want to talk about it now or wait till later.
I can wait till later. That's fine.
Okay, yeah, no, it's a very good question.
And secondly, what exactly do you mean by a frame of reference?
So a frame of reference, you can plot things in different ways. Like, one of the things we can look at is, say you've got the Earth and you've got the sun, and so you can plot what it looks like for somebody in Pittsburgh, and you can plot their motion around the sun. And in that plot, not only are you going to have the motion of the Earth, you're also going to have the rotating Earth. And so you have, like little spirals as the Earth goes around the sun. So that is a reference frame of centered at the sun and your motion around the sun. You could also do one that's fixed to the Earth instead. And so you just have, and in that one, your Pittsburgh frame, you're just going to be standing still because the frame is centered on the Earth. And so with respect to the Earth, Pittsburgh is not moving. Does that make sense?
So it's where the observer happens to be located. That determines what they see.
Yes, it's in terms of observers, but it doesn't have to be an observer. I mean, you can put your reference frame anywhere you want it to, anywhere you want to. You can have the frame be fixed in space, or you can have the frame rotate. And so it's, it gets, having all these different reference frames makes the math complicated.
Hmm. So speaking of math, I hear a myth or an urban legend that the only math we need to put satellites in orbit or go to the moon are Newton's laws. We don't need Einstein. But this looks pretty complicated, and you just mentioned the math was complicated. So I assume we're taking relativity into account when doing all this.
So for this stuff, we just use Newton's laws. But if you're talking about, there are other things, observing stars and stuff, you need to take relativity into account. And communications, you need to take relativity into account because your transmissions are going at the speed of light. but this particular math is Newtonian.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for
Sure.
your question. Okay, Robert, go. There you go. Go on.
So the mission priorities these are things we wanted to accomplish with the mission, and we had to make a trajectory that would accomplish these. And that first one is the important one: test the heat shield. You can do some of the other objectives without a lunar mission, but to test the heat shield, to come back at those velocities, you need to go out pretty far away from the Earth. You could achieve it without going all the way out to the moon, but you still needed to go pretty far out. So that was our highest priority for this flight. That was kind of drilled into us. So you needed to test the in-space operation of the spacecraft, so the propulsion system, the electronics, etc. So you needed some time and time of flight to do that. We also wanted to recover the spacecraft. A lot of it was to prove that we could do that before we put astronauts on, but we also wanted to get it back and look at all the components afterward. And you see that that's what people are doing in this picture. So that's a spoiler alert that we got it back. Mm-hmm. There are other objectives that like testing the navigation equipment. And so we wanted a trajectory that would do all of this. And these were all factors that went into the trajectory design. Okay, here's where we can talk about eclipses, the constraints. These were things that we also needed to take into account when we were designing the trajectory. So for the Apollo spacecraft, they didn't have the same problem because they had fuel cells, but the fuel cells would only last for about 2 weeks. We use solar arrays on Orion, and so the advantage is that you can have longer missions. The disadvantage is that you do need sunlight. So if we were in an eclipse for longer than 90 minutes, and here an eclipse is the Earth or the moon blocking the sun. So after 90 minutes, that was a conservative estimate to prevent loss of power. And so I talked about the DPC earlier. This was one of the potential eclipse mitigation methods. So when we were analyzing the trajectories, there were enough trajectories that had these eclipses that it would significantly impact the number of available launch dates we had. And we wanted to recover those launch dates. And so one of our team members, Sarah Smallwood, worked on an eclipse mitigation method, and that involved adding trajectory correction burns depending on where the eclipse took place. So if there was an eclipse over here, we would put a correction burn here to move us out of the eclipse. And this particular one was one of the more complicated ones because it changed our orbit plane. So, and adding that eclipse mitigation method helped us recover a lot of launch dates.
Just to make sure I understand, when you're saying change the orbit plane, what you're saying is like it was going to be, the moon was going to be, and the Earth or whatever was going to be between the sun, and it wasn't going to get any sun. So you were going to try to raise it up above that so that it would get sun. Is that kind of the idea?
Yes, that's the idea.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. One of the other constraints was that we wanted to land during daylight. And the reason for that was because we wanted to watch how the parachutes performed to make sure that they were working the way we expected them to. And it would also help recover the spacecraft and help with safety for the recovery team. We also wanted to land where we wanted to, which was near San Diego, but not in it. So it was a little off the coast. And we didn't want to use more fuel than we had, and we didn't want to hit the moon. So those were constraints we put into our trajectory.
Why San Diego? Out of curiosity.
I don't know all of the reason for that, but I think we had a fleet out there already in that general area. And so the Navy was the ones who were going to recover the spacecraft. So I think that was the most convenient. But that is my understanding. I could be wrong.
was gonna say, I have a friend whose husband is an engineer for that Navy site. It is a very big one, Robert, so that makes sense. that tracks.
Okay. Okay, launch window selection. Yeah, I think this was, I think Scott asked this question earlier. So yeah, we often for a lot of these days, we had launch windows for several hours based on fuel and based on non-overflying areas we didn't want to hit. But because of rocket considerations, I think the fuel could only be on board for so long, and crew health considerations, which wasn't an issue for Artemis I, but it will be later. We needed to limit the launch windows to 2 hours. So some people on the team wrote a software to find the best 2 hours out of our launch window, the best consecutive 2 hours based on the mission constraints and fuel usage. And Jacob, who was one of the people working on that, called it Window Shopper. Automation. Okay, yeah, one of the big deals was that there were a lot of trajectories. So every month we would have 12 to 15 potential launch dates, and we needed to generate a trajectory for every minute of that launch window. So it could be up to 120 minutes. And so that adds up really quickly. So it's a lot of launch dates per month, and we didn't know which month we were going to fly, so we had to keep churning them out. And so we couldn't do that by hand. That would just take forever. So we had to automate all of that. So we developed some code to automatically generate these trajectories. And again, Jacob named it Damocles, which was that raised some eyebrows.
Just you personally, how much time do you spend coding versus modeling or doing other work?
Yeah, a lot. I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but it is, the job was a lot of coding. And that is, I mean, I've done a lot of coding throughout my career, but I didn't take computer science, so it is not, I am sure somebody who has a computer science background could do it a lot better than I do.
Wow. I just would have assumed you had a computer science background to be doing a lot of kinds of things.
It would have helped. But
you have a more of a math background then?
Engineering, yeah.
Engineering, okay. Wow.
Yeah, I'll say everyone in engineering these days does get a programming background. It's probably just not as we don't know all the tricks that you would learn with a computer science background.
Robert, would you mind going back to the 2 slides? I just wanted to add something. The next, yeah.
This one?
Yes. The 2 hours was had 2 considerations. One consideration was for the Johnson side, for the Orion, but also, and these look like these address the human space requirements. Also, because the mission consisted of SLS, which is at Marshall, their consideration for the launch window included consideration. There was some thermal considerations, there was some meteorological considerations, and also there was some other targeting considerations. But I think for them, the key criteria was some thermal condition which dictated this 2 hours. So
okay, yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to point that out.
Okay, I'll say that was Tokes, and he was on our team, and he joined us a few years ago, but before that he was out at Marshall, which he mentioned, and Marshall is the one in charge of the SLS. So off-nodal trajectories. So we didn't end up flying any of these, which is great, but we still needed to have them just in case. So we can't trust everything's going to work correctly, so we needed options in case something went wrong. So we had 3 different flavors. Now I'll go into more of those, more detail later, but there are some options to return us to the nominal trajectory if there was a minor issue. There are alternate missions, so if something happened early in the mission, we wanted to have a way to achieve at least some of the mission objectives, with even if we didn't go to the moon, or even if we didn't go to our target orbit around the moon. And then we had aborts where we needed to return the spacecraft, and we were not going to achieve most of the mission objectives, but we still wanted to do the heat shield test. So that was still a priority even for aborts. So return to nominal. So you heard Topes earlier. He was one of the people working on this set, and Brian Colleen also, which I think he is on the chat. He also worked on this. So you have Mr. Partial Burn. So if you, for some reason, had to delay the burn, you didn't perform it, but you have the option to do it later, or if you perform part of the burn but not the full one, then this option gives you a chance to do a trajectory correction burn to get you back on your nominal path. So that's if you had to have a trajectory problem, that's the best kind of problem to have, where you can get back and still complete your entire mission. Alternate mission. So if a problem happened early in the mission, during the ascent stage or during TOI, we would not have been able to get to the DRO. So we would have had, ideally we would have performed, in that situation, we would have performed some kind of alternate mission, either high Earth orbit or doing a lunar flyby. And we could still achieve at least some of the mission objectives, in particular the heat shield test. And there were some alternate missions where we would have gotten to a situation where we couldn't do the heat shield test, and we would just get as many objectives done as we could and come back. But if that had happened, we would have had to do another flight to do the heat shield test. So
I like that every time you have heat shield test, it's in all caps. That really shows it's very, very important.
Yes, that was drilled into us. So these are some examples of trajectories. It might be a little hard to see, but here's a high Earth orbit. You can see the Earth is here, the moon is here, and the spacecraft comes out pretty far away from the Earth, but nowhere near the moon. And I believe this trajectory was enough to achieve the heat shield test, but I could be wrong. Here's a lunar flyby. Earth is here, and the moon is here. And you can see the spacecraft goes all the way out and comes around the far side of the moon and comes back. And so these are some of the things we could have done if things had gone wrong early in the mission. And see, yeah, Colin and Tim were the ones who worked on these trajectories. Then there were aborts. And if a problem happened that made it unsafe for Ryan to continue, we would need to return the spacecraft. We might try to minimize fuel or minimize the time to return, depending on the situation. And there were 3 types of aborts. There's a direct abort, which is a quick turnaround to get back to Earth, where you could do a flyby, where you fly by the moon and use its gravity to direct the spacecraft back to Earth. Or you could do a missed burn abort, and that's if you missed a major burn and then you had to abort, then you would do it. The trajectory usually ended up looking pretty similar to the flyby trajectories. So these are 3 of the solution families that we could have had. These are for the outbound part before the flyby. So it could have been a direct abort. Here's the Earth, here's the moon, and you do a turnaround to come back. So this looks pretty similar to the high Earth orbit alternate mission. It's generally the same concept. This one is a flyby behind the moon. This is what people typically think about when you hear about a flyby. This is sort of kind of what the Artemis II trajectory is going to look like, sort of. The spacecraft goes out, comes around behind the moon, and comes back. And that's pretty similar to the lunar flyby alternate mission. And then another one is coming in front of the moon, which is not one we expected to find originally. But if you can come in front of the moon, and that's going to deflect your trajectory a little bit, so you can swing out and come back. So those were the ones that were available to us before the flyby. After the flyby, we had these options. So this is where the flyby is. You're coming out here, you can turn around and cut in front of the moon and use the gravity again to swing you back out to Earth. Another option was a modified version of the nominal trajectory. So it looks pretty similar, but you might have the burns occurring at different times, or you might have fewer burns, but it looks pretty similar to what you were, to the nominal trajectory. And this one is swinging you really far away from the moon and coming back to Earth. And so for perspective, these dotted lines show the DRO, and the DRO has a radius of about 70,000 kilometers. So you can see that this gets really far away from the moon. All right, so that's what I had about the background for the design part of trajectories. And this is the mission evaluation room. I'll probably come back to this picture later to kind of show some stuff. The mission evaluation room, which we call the MER, is populated with people who designed, built, or tested the subsystem. So it's people who were very familiar with their subsystem. And so they work with each person works with a corresponding flight controller during that mission. So, or each console works with a corresponding flight controller. And you usually have multiple consoles working with the same flight controller, just different aspects of that flight controller's job. So you troubleshoot anomalies, you answer questions either from the flight controller or from other people in the MER, and you monitor your subsystem. So this is a picture. There's Tim and Colin here. And as an extreme example of something we could have done in the MER, something from Apollo 13 that probably a lot of people are familiar with. There was a point in the mission where their carbon dioxide levels were getting high, and because they were just relying on the lunar module's cartridges. So they needed to start using the command module's cartridges, which were square shaped, but the lunar modules were round. So they had to find some way of making the square cartridges work with the round holes for the lunar modules. And so they got a team to do that, to figure out how to do that based on the items that were available on the spacecraft. And so that's a pretty extreme example of the kind of work we might get asked to do.
I have a question that's related to this specifically. So you've basically just gone through and introduced us to the idea that there were a lot of trajectories that were designed. It's almost like if something went wrong, instead of going to the chalkboard and figuring out what to do, you would have preset, trajectories that you could sort of search for and say, oh, if this happens here, this is the answer that we pre-designed. Was any of that kind of work done for these kind of examples where is anybody looking at, oh, well, if we're on a mission and this breaks, here's what we can use in the spacecraft to fix it, or will this kind of stuff always be done kind of on the fly with experienced personnel?
That's a very good question. I don't know. Yeah, so the people working with the spacecraft hardware itself, they probably have some idea, maybe. Then I have no idea what their training is. They might be trying to come up with things like this. But yeah, I have no idea. It's a good question. But there is some process. I don't know what it is, where different companies compete for contracts, and so they make sure that the company is capable of providing that part.
Yeah, but design work has come a long way since the 60s too. In that sense of product design wasn't really much of a concept in the 60s like it is now. So I would expect that there's probably better planning on something like that than there would have been at that point in time.
Well, yeah,
I would hope so. And also, these two vehicles were built by different companies, and so I think that's another part of it.
Yeah, I mean, you would at least hope that all these different companies would have all their systems to be compatible in case something does go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. that is outside of my area of expertise.
And I'm sure no matter
Yeah.
what kind of planning went into it in the first place, if something new happened that wasn't expected or planned for, it's still going to be the same situation.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Right.
I mean, yeah, I mean, who's that guy, Rumsfeld? There's unknown knowns and known unknowns and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So yeah, stuff happens. So
I would just add that number one priority is crew safety. So definitely any scenario that puts the crew in extreme danger is something that has a plan for it. And other priorities may or may not be considered or planned according to the, you know, whatever funding or, you know, whatever upper management is willing to add funding for. So crew safety is always number one. And also crew safety cannot always 100% be mitigated, but as close as they can get, that's always the top priority. And there's always a backup.
And I'll add to that, part of our training, we were required to read the investigation report from the Columbia accident. And yeah, that was pretty sobering reading, just finding all the steps along the way where something was overlooked or ignored. And yeah, and then seeing how that turned out. So yeah, that's something people are very aware of and keep aware of. Yeah, so, I guess I'll maybe go back here. Yeah, you can see these are all the people who are on the MER. These are all the different consoles here. I'll probably talk a little bit more about it later, but we had some live shots from the flight while we were watching. There's one here that you can see the back of a monitor here, and there was one up at the front of the room where this would be. Our console is right here. So that's the top of my head. That's the top of Josh's head. That's the top of Tim's head. And I think this was, pretty soon before the DRI burn.
where is the MER? I mean, what is it? Is it Cape Canaveral, or where does this launch from?
Well, the launch was from Cape Canaveral, yeah. The MER is in the Mission Control Center, or I mean, it's not in the Mission Control Center. It's in the same building as Mission Control at Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Oh, okay.
And so, and that's really cool getting to work in that building.
Okay.
So this is Targo is our console, and here's Amelia, Tim, and they were handing over to me. And this was shortly before the point in the mission where Orion was the farthest from the Earth. So it was the farthest point that any human-rated spacecraft had ever been. And so Amelia got to make that announcement to the MER. So that was really cool.
I'm looking at her screen and it looks like she has 30 or 40 windows open there.
Yep, it's busy.
That's crazy.
Yeah, a lot of stuff to keep track of. So our team Targo, it stood for trajectory analysis, retargeting, and optimization. Again, Jacob was involved with naming it, and also Jeff Gutkowski, who is our team lead. So our job was to help the flight dynamics officers, and that's pronounced FIDOs. And I put their logo up here. I thought it was really cool. Mm-hmm. And we helped them before and during the flight. So, I mean, during the flight, we had a lot of stuff we needed to do. And before the flight, we were figuring out what they would need during the flight and figuring out how to provide it to them. So during the flight, we monitored the trajectory. We helped with planning upcoming burns. The FIDOs did the majority of that work, but we would look in our software and do some lo-fi modeling of it to make sure it kind of matched up with them. And then we would also talk about contingency options with the FIDOs. We delivered updated off-nominal trajectories. That was a lot of work. Yeah, I'll get to that more later. Oh, yeah, one of the things I forgot to mention at the time, I talked about how many nominal trajectories there were and how we had to automate that. Off-nominal trajectories, it was just a huge amount. So there were already a lot of nominal trajectories. For every nominal trajectory, we had thousands of off-nominal trajectories. And so that was a huge deal. It took up lots of space, lots of time to run. And Colin, who was right here, he came up with well, first off, he made it run more quickly than it was running before. So that helped us get the products delivered regularly, which was great. And he also came up with a database for storing them. Before, they were taking up too much computer space. And so we didn't have enough, and we were talking about how to select the best ones to store. But Colin came up with a database that could store all of them. So that really revolutionized how we did that.
Robert, if I could mention, after we kind of decompressed a little bit and I started thinking back, I went back and I looked, and I think Brian and I probably generated something on the order of plus minus 7 million trajectories for just the misburn cases. Before, these were pre-flight trajectories, just to give a rough idea.
That's for all the launch periods?
Yes, for the 1 year, for the whole of 2022.
Yeah, that's a lot. And that's just one
that's
of
a
the
lot,
off-nominals.
even just to store in a database. That's a lot. That's a lot of information.
Yeah, and so, and also during flight, we coordinated with Targos, often about delivering these off-nominal trajectories. We responded to questions from the FIDOs, from other people in the MER, and from management. And we also updated console logs. And so that was so that other Targos coming on in future shifts would know what work was done, what work needed to be done, and what other things had come up during our shift, just for situational awareness, so they knew what everyone else was talking about. And we had a lot more paperwork than we expected. Again, usually dealing with the deliveries of these off-nominal trajectories. So here's an Apollo 13 example for Targos, and I think Scott kind of alluded to this earlier. During the movie of Apollo 13, there was a scene at the chalkboard where Gene Kranz is standing up at the front and points to where they are and says, we can either do a quick turnaround and come back right away, or we can loop around the moon. And so they knew those were the two options they had. And if Apollo 13 had happened today, Targos would have been the ones to have told the flight controllers that those are the options they had before the flight. So yeah, like Scott said, a lot of these trajectory options we came up with we're trying to think of as many contingency scenarios as we could before the flight, so that if something happened and that situation happened, we already had a plan ready. So on console, we supported, oh yeah, I also wanted to go back to this and say, so Jeff Kukowski was our team lead, and he was the one who interfaced with management and such. And if we'd had an anomaly during the flight that had required us, he would have been the one representing us. And Brian and Randy were the ones who led our training. They came up with the sim schedule, and they came up with what we needed to do to be certified. So all the testing and how many sims we needed to support, etc. And they both had some background in human flight operations, or human space flight operations. And Brian in particular used to be a flight controller. Okay, so this is us on console. And so this picture, there's Brian. I was just talking about him. There's Amelia, there's Max, and here's Randy. He was the other co-lead. So we would support 24/7 starting even before the flight. We had 3 shifts, day, swing, and night. And people changed shifts throughout the flight. So Randy was the one who did the scheduling, and he wanted to make sure that one person wasn't on, say, the night shift all the time, although Max was on the night shift an awful lot during the flight. Usually there were 2 people on shift at a time, a prime and a secondary, and we each took turns being prime and secondary. So it was supposed to be fair. Like there was no hierarchy as far as that went. It was just kind of pretty random, except for that first day. And so the scheduling was pretty complicated because we had a lot of different launch days, potential launch days, and some people weren't available. Particularly this flight, it occurred during the holidays, and so some people had already taken off and were already going to be out of town for that. And then also our first day schedule was fixed according to the launch events and not according to what time of day it was. And so all this kind of factored into making even the scheduling of our shifts complicated. So Randy wrote some code to do that.
How long did this entire flight take from launch to return?
So there were, so this particular flight, the one that we actually flew, was 26 days. There were other options, and I was going to mention that in the next slide, but I think this is a good time also. There were different mission classes we could have flown. There's a 26 through 28 days, or it could have been 38 to 42 days, where we would have spent an extra orbit in the DRO. So Max wrote some code for each launch date, it would pick the best mission class to go with. And so the day that we actually launched, it ended up being the 26-day mission was the best one. But it could have been as long as 42 days.
And again, this was just to test everything to meet all your mission objectives. Well, when we do send humans to the moon, will the whole trip take 26 days or more longer that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It depends on what we're doing out there. The first Artemis II is supposed to be about 10 days total. The Artemis III and beyond, it depends on what we're doing out there, but I think they're generally on the order of 26, 30 days, I think. Something like that. Or no, sorry, I'm sorry. It's, well, you know, that might, yeah. Anyway, something like that.
So, I mean, on average, how long does it take to get from Earth to the moon on your planned trajectory?
That varies a lot too. For Artemis I, it was 4 or 5 days. I think it's going to be pretty much the same for Artemis II, and for Artemis III and beyond, it could vary 4 to 10 days, something like that. It depends on where we want to go, and we want to target a specific orbits because we're meeting up with for Artemis III and beyond, we're meeting up with the spacecraft that's already out there, and so we need to time things right so we can rendezvous and dock with that target. And so getting that to line up correctly, it could be 4 to 10 days or so.
So I'm looking at the ConOps. It's 31 days for Artemis III.
Okay.
Can vary from 25 to 34 days.
Okay.
That's the actual crewed mission to the moon.
The Artemis III is the one that's going to land people again. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So what's Artemis II?
Artemis II is going to do a flyby, so it'll look. Let me go back.
Oh, I'm sorry if I missed that.
Similar to this.
Okay. Wait.
And so that's a crewed mission as well, right, Robert? Artemis II has a crew.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's going to be doing another test of the spacecraft, and in particular, the life support systems.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was confused. I thought Artemis II was going to be actual landing, but Artemis III is the actual landing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
And so this is our team, just to give you an idea of how many people were doing this work and how it was kind of split up between people. And so Tokes that we talked to, I'll also mention that this is, I'm only talking about the Artemis I work. Most of the people on this team were working on other Artemis missions too, or even other missions completely. So Tokes was working on the missed burn recoveries, and he was also on console. Amelia was our main analyst for the nominal trajectories, and she was on console. Colin, he designed some of the alternate missions, and he built the abort database and helped run abort cases and was on console. Tim worked on the nominal trajectory. He did some of the updates to that, and he designed some of the alternate missions and trajectory analysis tools, and he was also on console. Randy developed some trajectory design tools. Randy did some of everything, it seemed like. He designed disposal trajectories. I didn't talk about those. That's if something had gone wrong and we couldn't recover the spacecraft, we would have put it into an orbit or crashed it into the moon to make sure that it was not in a place where something else could hit it. Yeah, so Randy did that work. He was co-lead for the Targo training, and he was also on console. Josh joined the team shortly before launch. He had been an intern with us before, so he wasn't completely new, but yeah, he didn't really have time to get fully up to speed before we kind of threw him into it. And he was on console. Jeff was our team lead. I worked on the abort trajectories and ran abort cases and was on console. Matt was working on something. One of the things he was working on was somewhat related to what we're doing, but he volunteered to help out during the flight because especially during the early stages, we had a lot of work to do those first couple of days. And so we needed extra people. And so he volunteered to do that. So that was a huge help. Brian, he designed the missed burn recoveries. He was a co-lead for the Targo training, and he was also on console. Sarah developed the eclipse mitigation algorithm, and she worked on the trajectory scan software, Damocles. And then she was, well, I mean, we all did that. We all worked on that software, incorporated our bits into it. She was the one who kind of maintained it and made sure we didn't break it. And she was on console. Max wrote the mission selection logic, and he also ran abort cases and was on console. Elizabeth wrote some of the plotting tools that we used for our analysis. And Jacob, he was the one who designed the nominal trajectory that we flew. So he's been working on this for a long time. He also developed the trajectory optimization and design tools, including the main tool that we used for designing all of our doing all of our trajectory work. And he also helped run abort cases during flight. So yeah, so that's our team, and that's kind of how we divided everything up. So that kind of gets an idea, and I'm sure that other teams have similar divisions like this.
An impressive crew of people.
They are, yeah. Everyone was super sharp and dedicated, and also fun to be around. They have great senses of humor.
I'm sorry, how many teams do you have, or are there that you coordinated with? Maybe that's a hard question to ask, but if this is your team, I imagine that the other teams are comparably staffed, whatever their job breakdowns are. But how many teams are there?
That is a good question. So in the MER, I know there were about 20 consoles, and I don't know how many teams there were that worked on aspects of the flight that were not on the MER. You know, I know there's people who built the rocket, so you have to imagine that there's probably a bunch of sub teams doing that. There's people who worked launch control. There's the flight controllers. Yeah, there are different management organizations who oversee different aspects of the flight. Yeah, a lot of people.
Could I put in something?
Sure.
Go for it.
We worked very closely with the guidance team, and we got a lot of inputs from NAV. And I think we also, verified some of their real-time data. And then also, of course, we interface very directly with the flight dynamics officer. I think those were the key people who we, were always in touch with, holding hands with, and that kind of thing.
Robert,
apart from the
sorry to
others
interrupt.
that Robert mentioned.
Okay. I had a question for Robert. Can you give us a description of what it's actually like to be there working at the console in the MER? Even just from a human perspective, are you kind of all keyed up and excited? Is there a lot to pay attention to? Is it a really busy time where you're really trying to pay attention to like 12 things at once and respond to questions, or is it kind of like, I'm going to sit here and read my book for an hour and nothing's going to happen? It's like, what's that actual experience like for you?
It depended on the day. For the early part of the mission, all the way up to RPF, I feel like it was pretty busy. And after RPF, we didn't have a whole lot to do. We couldn't affect the trajectory that much. And so that's when things were a little slow for us. We were still on console because we still wanted to monitor the trajectory and help out with correction burns if necessary, and answer questions. But that last part of the flight was pretty slow for us. But up until then, we were, like you said, we were monitoring what was going on in all the voice loops and logging that. We had our own work that we were doing, monitoring things, keeping up with the trajectory, and for delivering the off-nominal trajectories. So we did that before the flight. We gave them a whole bunch of trajectories, and those thousands of trajectories, we had some tools that they could use to look at them more easily. And during the flight, we got updated position information. And so we would crank out more trajectories based on that updated position. And so we were doing that throughout the flight. And so that was rough, because a lot of times we would have somebody would be on console. They would do their 9+ hours on console, and then they would, get home and have to work on cranking out these off-nominal trajectories on top of that, or reviewing trajectories that had already been created to make sure that they were good. So there were a lot of long days, a lot of long hours in that early flight. And it was not much sleep, and it was exhausting, but I loved being there in that atmosphere. You also asked if we were keyed up, and I know I was. But this is something I've been dreaming about doing since I was a kid, and it lived up to expectations.
That's cool. Does Tox or Brian have anything to add? They're both here, right? And they were both on console?
Yeah.
No, I'd just echo what Robert said. I mean, it's crazy on console. There's so much to do. You're always thinking about what's the next thing that could go wrong. Can I do any work right now to alleviate the problems that would be caused if that thing did go wrong? And you're always just on mentally. You're always working on something and answering questions for people. And sometimes you have to take a pause to look up at the screens and see the pretty pictures of the spacecraft that's sending pictures of the moon back in real time, which is awesome.
So you did get a couple of seconds in there where you got to think about where you were and what you were doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for me, it's a real blessing to have been able to help build, improve, correct some of the trajectories that the spacecraft actually flew. And that's my feeling that I took away from it. Just a lot of great joy from that.
Well, it's sure something to be proud of. It's amazing to be part of something like that.
Yeah, it was a great experience.
Okay, guys, let me ask the difficult question. in the next 10, 20 years, how much is artificial intelligence going to replace all these names on this list?
We already have, so Max in particular is already working on that. Yeah, good question. I think we're still going to want to have people in the loop to look at it and to set up the parameters that the AI is going to be using to determine what's a good trajectory or not. So I think we're still going to have people for a while.
I'm going to just throw in real quick because Jane and I work in web development, and we've been working with ChatGPT. And the big thing for us is ChatGPT going to replace content developers? And what we've seen is that it is essentially looks like it's a good tool right now for people to use, but isn't replacing anyone. And for instance, Jane needed to have it generate some stuff, and she came back to me and was basically saying, well, this isn't really good. This isn't what I can use. And then her experience was I basically tried to do the same thing, but I was better at asking the questions and got better results. And so I'm not afraid for my job as a content developer yet, because basically it's a tool, and if you don't know how to use it, it's just going to create crap. So I imagine that's going to be the same in your field. You're going to need expert people to understand what the tool is doing and whether it's being used usefully or not.
Oh, and even making the tool.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Robert. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's yeah, so I was going to talk about some stuff that happened during flight. So there's the launch and ascent. So before the flight even started, Colin was on the shift before the flight because he worked on alternate missions. And so the thought was that he might be talking to the FIDOs about how they wanted to handle any alternate missions or any contingency scenarios that happened. So he was there pre-flight, and then Tim and Brian came in and took over for him, and they were there for ascent up through TOI. Yeah, I don't know, since Ryan is here, did you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. The ascent shift is incredibly nerve-wracking, but incredibly exciting. It's the most dynamic phase of flight. It's the highest probability of failure. So it's really nerve-wracking, but it only lasts 8 minutes, and it is very adrenaline inducing to see the plots, all the data start lighting up, the thrusters start and turn on, and then before you know it, it's over and you're in space. So it was awesome. It was quick. But hopefully for Artemis II, we'll get Robert or someone in the chair for that.
Yeah, so I watched all of that from home. But yeah, it didn't really line up too well. Like, I should have been asleep because it didn't line up well with the shift I was going to take, but I wanted to know what kind of day I was going to have. So I made sure to stay up through TOI, and that worked perfectly. And after that, Randy and Sarah took over from Brian and Tim, although I think Brian worked an extra shift, it sounded like, after his ascent shift. And then, yeah, and after Randy and Sarah, Colin and I took over from them. And we started building and delivering the off-nominal trajectories. I already talked about that. My personal highlight was the outbound powered flyby. That's when we actually got back to the moon. And I got to be on console for that. And because of the luck of the schedule, I was the prime targo for that shift. And they did a go, no-go poll in the MER. And so that reminded me, of the Apollo era where you hear the people, all the flight controllers doing that. And so that was exciting too. And so we got to do that. And I realized that right before they did the poll, I realized, oh, I'm the prime targo. I get to be the one who says go. and so when it came to my turn, the MER manager said targo, and I said go. And I expected her to move on to the next console, and there was a pause, and then she said targo, and I realized I'd said it on the wrong voice loop. So I probably confused somebody. So I switched over really quickly and said go again, and they moved on. But, yeah, and then we got to see the moon getting bigger and bigger. And the last thing the maneuver itself, the burn itself, happened behind the moon. So we didn't have signal when it happened. And so the last thing we saw before the spacecraft went around the moon was the Earth just above the moon's horizon. And so it was a really cool image. And
Was that the one that was your favorite picture?
The one that was my favorite picture happened during RPF, so it was the return one. So it was, yeah. And so there was somebody had said that if the burn did not work correctly, the spacecraft was going to return a couple minutes early. And so we had two countdown clocks. There was one that was the early one that we didn't want to see, and one that was the right time that we did want to see. And so while the spacecraft was out of communication, there wasn't really anything for us to do. So people, took restroom breaks or stood and talked, and it was really exciting. Everyone was really keyed up about that. And then a few minutes beforehand, the MER manager quieted everyone down, and we watched the countdown, and we got to the one we didn't want to see, and that came and went. So that was a relief. And then we got to the one we did want to see, and we got, the hints kind of trickled in. First, we saw little bits of telemetry start becoming active, and then on those monitors, we got an image. And it was an Earthrise image, but the moon was in darkness at that point. So it looked like the Earth was just floating by itself in space. And yeah, when people saw that, everyone started clapping. So that was a nice experience. And then some of the managers came. Vanessa Weiss, who was the center director, and Howard Hugh, who was the program director, and Julie Kramer-White, I know, is some high up official. I don't know exactly what her job is, but all of them came and congratulated everyone on consoles. It was nice to see how important that was to all of them. Yeah, so that was my personal highlight for the flight. And then Thanksgiving happened while the flight was going on. Several of us were on console for that, and again, the managers came and they brought everyone Thanksgiving meals, and they personally made sure that everyone got one and that they had something for their dietary preferences.
Nice.
So yeah, that was great. And the flight was going so well with all the tests and such that people decided to start adding tests. I think some of this they thought about before the flight, but it's something they wanted, but they didn't think they would have time for it. And so since things were going so well, they just started adding them. And I think that was a good indication of how successful the flight was. And then the return powered flyby was another highlight for me. I mean, it was, I got to be on console for that too. Sarah was the lead for that shift. And that's where my favorite images from the flight came from, that shift. And that was the critical burn. That one had to work to get Orion back to Earth. And so it was, the atmosphere wasn't quite the same. It wasn't quite as festive because we were coming back rather than arriving there in the first place. But this was an even more important burn. And yeah, that was still a really fun shift. And then, yeah, after that, it was a return to Earth, and at least for us, things slowed down. A lot of the other consoles were still checking out their systems. And we didn't fly any off-nominal trajectories. I was on the next to last shift for Targos, and then I handed over to Brian. So Brian was the last Targo. And after him, someone from the entry, descent, and landing team took over. And so I got to watch the splashdown from home on my phone. Yeah, Julie was at work that time. She got to watch the launch, but she was on call over the weekend, so she wasn't able to watch the splashdown. But Isabel woke up from her nap just in time to see it. And so it was just kind of a surreal experience for me, just thinking about I mean, I kind of expected things to work correctly, but I didn't think they would work that smoothly. And also just having this thing that you've been working toward for so long, and it's just been on paper for a long time, and then seeing it actually happen and everything go smoothly and work correctly. And it's like, oh, that was what we thought it was going to do. That's what we planned for it to do. And it did. That was just a kind of a surreal experience. And yeah, next time we're sending people, this is the crew. So this is Reed Weissman, who's the commander. Victor Glover is the pilot. Christina Koch is one of the mission specialists, and Jeremy Hansen is the other mission specialist. And then, yeah, this is Isabel watching the launch, and she is very enthusiastic.
I love the little Artemis shirt. That's so cute.
Yeah, she was in a lot better mood the next morning.
Yeah.
And then you can also see a framed copy of Dreamforge in the background. Yeah, so that's all I have. Were there any other questions?
Well, let's see. You've done an exceptional job of answering questions as we went. Does anyone else want to unmute and just ask a question?
Yes, I have
Put
a
it,
question.
put it in chat, or if you don't want to say
Yeah, or
anything.
put it in chat, whatever. But sounds like Joe has a question.
Okay, I have a question on the ranging. Because when I think of ranging, that's only one dimension, which is distance. And I can see how that's done.
Mhm.
How are you getting the other axes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it. Yeah, I think that's outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, that's a fair answer.
I think maybe because you do get the ranging from different times during flight. You also have it from 3 different stations on the Earth, so maybe that helps too.
Yes, that would help. Okay.
Also might be outside of your expertise, but one of the things you had mentioned is on Artemis III, you'll be designing trajectories to meet up with another spacecraft. Is my understanding correct that right now anyway, that's a SpaceX Starship as a lander?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's going to be waiting for us, and we're going to dock with that. And 2 of the 4 astronauts are going to take Starship down to the moon.
Yeah, that probably adds a whole nother level of complexity when you're working with another company completely.
Oh, yes, I'm sure it does. I'm sure it's going to affect our team to some degree, but yeah, I think management maybe even more so.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions?
Robert, Tokes, and Brian, I just wanted to thank all 3 of you for taking the time. I hope I didn't miss anybody. I believe it was the 3 of you. This was really, really cool. And Robert, at the beginning of the meeting, you alluded to your creative writing work. Where might we find that if we wanted to, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think Jane put a link in the chat. So for one of the short stories, I've also got a website at robertharpold.com, and I recently, I technically have a Twitter account, but I think I'm stopping using that, and I'm gonna try Instagram, even though I'm not exactly sure how to use it yet.
And Robert, the link that's in the chat is from a story that Robert had in Dreamforge magazine back in issue 4, but he has another story upcoming here at the end of the year called No Hugs for Holographic Fathers. And that's going to be probably in our fall issue and then in the print edition at the end of the year.
Very cool.
I don't know how you find time for writing with an 18-month-old in a job like that.
Yeah, I mean, it comes out of sleep.
Okay, that makes sense, because there's only so much time in a day, and like I can't imagine having a lot of mental energy after doing the kind of work that you're doing during the day. because there's some kinds of work you can do and then come home and writing kind of makes sense. But I know Scott's always struggled with that because, you know, for most of his career, he's gone to work, he's written all day, and then come home and to write some more is hard. So I don't know, maybe because you're using the math and coding side of your brain, maybe it's different, but.
Yeah, I think that's also that's part of it, and I think also Julie and I are good about. My wife Julie is good. We're good about tag teaming with the chores and stuff, and so that really helps free up time for us.
Well, keep it going, that's for sure.
Yeah. And
Well, thank you.
maybe at some point we can have you back again. That would be really great. And I also wanted to echo an enormous thanks to Robert and Tokes and Brian. It's just beyond words that you could spend your time with us here today and help us understand what's going on, because, you know, especially at Dreamforge, our basic concept is that the human adventure is just beginning. It's like, you know, so many people these days are kind of, you know, down on the human race and apocalypse and climate change and all that. Not that we don't face problems, but I think we're much closer to the beginning of what humans can do than we are anywhere near the end. And the Artemis program is one of the leading, you know, things in that direction, that we're back in space and that we're, you know, back going to the moon. So it was really great of you guys to spend your time with us today.
And I think it makes everybody here appreciate the kind of, like, when everything you're telling us is one little team of maybe 20 that were in the console there and how many others were involved, and it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, Scott, there's a very optimistic sensibility about the whole thing, and that's really neat to see.
Yeah, and it's nice to see, like, you guys, like, the idea people on your team showed up to hear you talking about stuff that they already knew. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I'm glad they were here to share their experiences too.
Yeah, I am too. That was awesome.
Yes. All right. Well, we're going to have just a few more minutes where we're going to do some member announcements and talk about our meeting next month. You guys are free to leave or stick around for a couple of minutes, whatever you like to do, or stick around for a minute and then leave, whatever. But really, again, thank you very much for attending with us. We hope to have you back again one day, maybe when we're talking about Artemis II or the moon landing or something really exciting like that. And Robert, we'll be glad to have you back just to talk about your stories at some point. So
and also in the current issue of Dreamforge is the
that's
article that's flybys, launch windows, and selfies with the Earth and the Moon that was about this very subject with some of the same graphics I recognize. So the that article is in the current issue of Dreamforge as well, and I believe the link is in the chat for that as well.
Yes.